Hello everybody and welcome to the very latest CADS podcast. We're doing something a bit different tonight. We're getting our first published author, or maybe second, because I do believe we've had one on before, but certainly our first published author when it comes to a Spurs book. So I'm joined by Gareth Dace, who is the author of Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? Spurs in the 90s, Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity. And tonight we're going to be talking about our previous chairman, our two previous chairmen of the football club, Irving Scholar and Alan Sugar, and looking at what they did well, where they may have stumbled a little bit. And of course we're joined by Austin, who is here with us to give us a little bit of his own personal historical context on this, because he lived through all of it, whereas I only really remember the Sugar years. I can't remember the Irving Scholar stuff. So welcome to CADS, Gareth. How are you doing?
Hi, Stuart. Hi, Austin. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me on here. To clarify, I guess I'm your first published author of 2025. You can probably say that with some.
We can say that. It's just one of our regular members, Ashley Colley, actually has two books published. So we need to be a little bit, but none of them are football. None of them are football. So staying on topic. There we go. It is indeed the distinction. So what can you tell us about your book, please?
Okay, well, yeah, thanks for let me hold it up here. This is my book. It came out in April 2024, so it's been out for about 8 months now. Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? It's about Spurs in the 90s, which was my formative years as a Spurs fan. I was born in 1981, so my first game at Spurs was in '88, and I was hooked ever since then. I always wanted to write about the 90s. Just thought it was a fascinating decade. I think it's really the genesis for modern football, the 90s as a whole, and Spurs' role in that period. Really sets the scene for what happened to Spurs in the 21st century. So I always felt there was a story there to be told. It's a season by season guide through the decade, starting from 89-90, going all the way through to the year 2000, with some personal anecdotes in there as well. I was able to talk to David Howells, Jerry Francis, and a number of other, I guess, some famous Spurs fans as well, including the brilliant Julie Welsh, who wrote the foreword for me. He also wrote the biography of Tottenham Hotspur. It's been really well received. I've had some really, really nice comments and feedback, not just from Spurs fans, but from other fans as well. I mean, unfortunately, it's a very good read for an Arsenal fan, because of what happened to Spurs in the 90s, beyond about the title. But yeah, the 90s wasn't a vintage period for Spurs, which in some ways provided some therapy for me in getting all my ideas and memories down onto paper in the first place.
It was cathartic for you, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So you got Julie Welsh involved, because Julie Welsh is obviously a very well-known writer in the Spurs sphere. She updates the biography of Tottenham Hotspur. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. You're thinking of the same person. Yeah, it's either the 5th edition or the 7th edition's just come out, and she asked me to provide some stories and some memories in that, and she's quoted my book in there. So she's been it was a real godsend being put in touch with Julie in the first instance, and her providing the foreword for the first book, I think, lent it some real credibility as well. And I've been able to work with her on the second book. But yeah, I mean, she obviously knows her. She really knows her Spurs. She's a lifelong Spurs fan herself. She wrote a very, very good play in the early 80s, which is kind of a semi-biography about her time growing up as a Spurs fan in the early 60s. So that was called those glory days that came out in the early 80s, and also sort of charts her experiences as being the first ever female journalist on Fleet Street, and quite often the only female in the press boxes around football stadiums in the 80s too. So yeah, she's a really fascinating person to talk to. She's got very, very good memories, and she can really put into context. But I mean, Austin, I know you first started watching Spurs well before the 90s, unlike Stuart and I. But for Julie, originally, when I first spoke to her, she described the 90s as the eye roll decade. So it's the one where you thought, oh, God, then have I really got to remember this? And I think that probably sets into context quite nicely what the 90s are for a lot of people.
To put it into context,
hang on, just very quickly, are you Gareth, are you saying that Austin is old? Is that what you're telling us there?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. No, he's clearly a man of wisdom, which he's going to share with us now.
Yes,
Gareth, I'm 72. So My history with Spurs goes back to being a 4-year-old when my father, having finished 3 years at Durham University, went to London University, and we lived in Chingford. And for a year, he used to go to White Hart Lane, so in the push and run era. And so I picked up on Tottenham then, although I didn't start following Spurs until 1962. And the first game I ever remember watching live on television on a little grey screen with two teams, one of which was in white and one of which was in grey, played. And it was the 1962 Cup final.
Okay.
And Jimmy Greaves scored after 4 minutes and consigned me to 60 years of misery. But that's actually not true. It's just a line I use. So I've been a supporter since 1962, but I've always lived somewhere else until 1989 when I lived in London. I moved to London when I split up from my first wife. Irrelevant, but I didn't get to see Spurs live in London until I went to see a home game at the Den, where Gazza and Lineker were playing. But just qualifying that a little bit, I looked up Millwall because I hadn't a clue where Millwall was because I'd just moved to London. So I didn't know it apart from the tube system from the various visits I'd made. And Millwall was on the Isle of Dogs. So I drove to the Isle of Dogs and they said, "No, mate, you don't want to fucking live here. You want to go." Anyway, I eventually parked just off Deptford High Street and walked to the old Den and watched Spurs beat Millwall 1-0. And I think it was 1989, but it might have been 1990.
Yeah. It was just into 1990, I think.
We were kept in the ground for half an hour after the game, and then frog marched down to Deptford Station by the police. But the language from the Millwall supporters was appalling. But Gascoigne was at his height.
Yeah, that was immediately pre-World Cup in 1990. So yeah, he was at that point. It was still uncertain whether he'd actually be called up to the England squad or not. Yeah. Which was, for anyone who was watching him every week, was farcical because you knew he was the best midfielder probably in Europe at the time, let alone in England. And yeah, it was that was 1990 was Gascoigne's best period, either the World Cup and either side of it as well. That calendar year 1990, he was maybe as good as any player certainly I've ever seen at Spurs in the calendar year.
I would say that he was the best all-round footballer that Spurs have had. Although I maintain that Glenn Hoddle is the most talented footballer I've seen in the Spurs shirt. His touch on the ball was unbelievable, but he's slightly before both of you.
Just unfortunately, I just missed him as a player. Yeah, Gascoigne was my first hero. The first year I was watching them was the first season that he played for us. So I grew up, absolutely idolising him as a kid in the playground.
Which, of course, brings us on to Paul Gascoigne was, of course, signed by the first topic of our conversation tonight, Irving Scholar.
Good segue,
yeah. So Irving Scholar is obviously a little bit before my time. There's things I know about him, and we did have a quick chat about this before. I know he was a little bit of an innovator in football terms. He got Spurs involved in property development, which pretty much no one had done before. He was one of the guys who was very much involved in normalising the wages at clubs and trying to make sure that it was in line with the money that the club was making. So I guess the wages went up at that point. And also he did a lot of negotiation in regards to trying to get clubs to have a bit more of a say about the TV money. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think the important thing to say about Irving Scholar, and I'm really interested to get Austin's take on this because he will remember the Irving Scholar era, better than I do. Although I am quite well researched into Irving Scholar now. So, he probably started supporting Spurs about a few years before you actually, Austin. So he quotes the being taken as I think as a 6 or a 7-year-old to watch the team that had just won the league championship in 1951, and that's from that point. Before you were born, there you go. So he was a real Spurs obsessive. He grew up going to Spurs every week, and he made a lot of money during the 70s through property, and was domiciled in Monaco, but continued to go and watch Spurs and would travel anywhere up and down the country to go and watch them play. I heard a quote that friends would always remark that if he was going on a date with a lady. They knew that he would ask her at some point to name the Spurs double winning team, and if she couldn't, that would be it for the day. He would finish it there and then. So Spurs was very much his life. No one could question his obsession with Spurs, and I suppose he was a bit of an opportunist really, because when the West End at the old stadium was rebuilt in the early 80s, it was built at a time of quite a uncertainty, and Scholar had gone to a meeting held by the then club owners, Sidney Wale and Arthur Richardson.
Yeah.
And he was really concerned about the projections they were giving about how much it was going to cost. Because I mean, that was where he'd made his money. He'd made his money in property. And I'm getting all this from his book called Behind Closed Doors, which was a really important reference point for me. But he suggests that he never had any ambitions to take over the club, but he was concerned that this project was going to cost a lot of money. Capital rebuilds had really done a lot of damage to clubs. I think the best example was Chelsea, who had rebuilt the East Stand, which is still in place now in the 70s, and it had effectively cost the family who'd run the club for sort of 70, 80 years. It cost them ownership of the club. That's when Ken Bates took over for £1, and it was all because of this East Stand rebuild, which had gone so badly wrong financially. So Scholar was concerned about that and the knock-on effect that this cost would have on investing in the team. Because by the early 80s, you had the nucleus of this fantastic team, overseen by Birkinshaw with Hoddle, Ardiles, Villa, Archibald, Crooks. It was very close to being really at the pinnacle, at the summit of English football. So Scholar went about buying shares that had been issued in the club when the club was first created as a company back in the early 20th century. So he managed to get the book that told you who owned all the shares, and sometimes it was widows whose husbands had been given them in the 1920s or 1930s. Sometimes they were living in Australia and North America, and he went through the quite arduous process of writing to all of them and saying, "Look, can I buy your shares from you?" Until he got to the point where he had enough, where he could sort of enforce himself on the club owners to take over. I'm giving you a very abridged version there because I don't want to give away everything, because you'll read about it in my second book, which is out later this year. So in taking over the club, he was a real innovator and a real pioneer, as you alluded to, Stu. He, I think, really recognised the value of football at a point in time when football was reaching pretty much its darkest period. Hooliganism in particular was rife during the early 80s. Lots of people who I've spoken, social pariah. If you told people in social circles or at work that you were a football fan, it would considered you were a hooligan as well. It was it was a really, really dark time. So he saw the value in that. He wanted to improve the match day experience. He wanted to get families coming to games again. But more importantly, he wanted Spurs to be the best team around. He wanted Spurs to, in the 80s, to replicate what he'd seen in the early 50s and then had lived through in the early 60s. And I don't think anyone could deny that that was his ultimate ambition, was to see at Spurs at the very, very top of the tree. He understood the values of the club. I think he understood that Spurs had a particular DNA and a particular style about them. He wanted to make quite high profile and marquee signings, which can be seen throughout his tenure at the club. But I think with that, being that super fan, there were some quite significant flaws in his running of the club, and history ultimately doesn't remember Irving Scholar well, despite all of those things that should have been in his favour.
Yeah, I mean,
you said more positive things about Scholar than I've heard in my lifetime, because bearing in mind I was in the Northeast and North Yorkshire until 1989, and only came to London in 1989. I looked at things from afar. So I didn't go to Spurs games unless they were playing in Sunderland, Newcastle or Middlesbrough. They were the only, and Carlisle. They were the only places I'd seen Spurs until 1989. So my view of Scholar was that he was the person that created the first limited company in the league in whatever year it was, 88 or 89. And my gut feeling was that he'd ruined Spurs. But that's not based on knowledge, that's based on gut feeling and from a distance.
For sure.
So I speak as a distant fan.
I've deliberately only given one side of the argument so far because I mean you've touched on a couple of things there. Um, well, yeah, it was under him that Spurs became and this was one of his innovations that Tottenham Hotspur became a PLC in 1983. So they were the first club listed on the stock exchange, which
Was it
meant that
83?
yeah,
Crikey.
so it meant people could invest in the club. People could own shares. It opened up lucrative commercial opportunities as a result to get investment into the club. And over a period of time, Spurs invested in a number of diversification projects. So they bought a number of different companies, and the premise of this is fantastic. The premise is you buy these other companies that are going to be successful, they will make money, which you then pour back into the football club. Unfortunately, by the time you're talking about by the end of the 80s, the problem with that was that the companies they were bought were actually hemorrhaging money, which was then draining resources out of which is out the football club. Now, if you read Irving Scholar's book, you are led very much to the conclusion that nothing to do with me, Gov. It's this guy Paul Bobroff, who I've gone into business with, who's also bought into the club and invested in it, and is chairman of the PLC. He's the one that's caused all the problems here. Everything I'm doing is absolutely fine. So you have to kind of read between the lines a little bit. I guess the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So yeah, I mean, ultimately the things that cost Scholar in the end was the fact that he couldn't manage and control the finances of all the subsidiary companies, or at least the board of the PLC couldn't, because he was only chairman of the football club. He wanted to interfere with team matters, which cost Spurs, Keith Birkinshaw, who is Tottenham's second greatest manager of all time. That was a very, very clear clash of personalities straight away. Birkinshaw left in '84. He didn't actually say the famous phrase, "There used to be a club over there." It's always it's always reference to Keith Birkinshaw. A reporter actually said it to him, and he kind of nodded and agreed to it. So by proxy, Birkinshaw said it.
I've met Keith a few times because a friend of mine, Ronnie Kidd, used to arrange Spurs nights. This is going back to before I moved up north again, because I'm now in Richmond in North Yorkshire, whereas I was in London until 3 years ago. So I used to go to Spurs nights and meet players, and I met the general 3 or 4 times, and I really liked him, got on well with him.
Yeah.
So he's not very complimentary.
No, no, he isn't. I know
sure he's not.
No, and I mean, a lot of people I've spoken to aren't. Steve Perryman I've spoken to in length, and he's certainly not a fan of Irving Scholar. So Scholar wanted to be involved in everything. I mean, Steve Perryman essentially said to me, for the first 14, 15 years of his Spurs career, the directors were just people who sat at the front of the coach. Obviously, as club captain, they got to know him and speak to him, but otherwise they really kept their distance. But whereas Scholar came in straight away and he wanted to be front and centre of everything, he wanted to be on first name terms with all of the players. He wanted to come into the changing room. I have not seen anyone say that he ever wanted to pick the team, but you certainly felt that he was out there writing what his dream Spurs 11 was, and probably trying to insist on Birkinshaw and then David Pleat and Venables. The other big critic. Well, let me just tell you a Steve Perryman anecdote that I got from his book, but he relayed it to me as well, which was when the West Stand was built, or whilst it was being rebuilt, the players, so we're talking 81, 80, 81, 82, the players had to park about, 500 yards up the high road behind a petrol station, walk down the high road to the ground, because the West Stand was a building site. Once the car park had been rebuilt again, Scholar called Steve Perryman into his office and he said, "Well, look, the players, I'm going to ask you to continue parking where you are and walk down the high road, because we've got 72 corporate boxes here and we've promised all of them 2 parking spaces." And you can imagine how that conversation went with Steve Perryman. I'm glad to say in the end, the players were allowed to park there again. So there was always the feeling that Scholar, in wanting to find ways of attracting new fans to the club, actually alienated modern parlance, we probably call them legacy fans, fans like Austin, who'd been fans for a number of years. There was more interest in those corporate fans, and I guess that culminated when the East Stand was knocked down. It was one thing, the West Stand going down, but the East Stand and, of course, the shelf, that was sacrilege to knock down the shelf and to put boxes on there, which again, Scholar says wasn't his idea. It was Bob Roth's idea, and it was they really didn't have many solutions. And if you read into the detail of that, I guess I have some sympathy with him that there probably weren't many solutions to what they did with the East Stand, because it was at risk of failing a health and safety check. You've got to remember this was about the time of '85 and the Bradford fire. You had the Heysel incident. You've had other significant incidents at stadiums around England and Europe. So clubs were having to think about how they redeveloped and how they made their stand safe. And the shelf, I'm fortunate that I never got to see Glenn Hoddle play for Spurs, and secondly that I never got to stand on the shelf in its full glory. I would love to be able to go back in a time machine and stand on the shelf. I think for all its undoubted charm, and so many people I've spoken to have got such fantastic memories of it. It was also, like many stands of its time, it was slightly decrepit. I'm sure people remember the stench from the lower tier where the police horses were kept. It wasn't safe. You'd get absolutely drenched if you stood on the shelf. The roof only covered the seats at the end. So they needed to do something with the East Stand. But yeah, to pull down the shelf and then put boxes up there was the point that he lost fans, and it was the point of no return.
But I mean, bringing in executive boxes was, again, he was one of the first to do it in terms of English football. So if you look further ahead, you can't build a stadium nowadays without executive boxes, because that's basically where a lot of the money is. So again, you could kind of say he was ahead of the time a little bit there. So if he's saying that was down to Paul Bobroff, maybe he was doing himself a bit of a disservice, or just trying to. I don't need the issues. I don't want the problems. I don't know what he was doing there. But also one of the things that really led to his downfall was the financial side of things, and that a lot of that was the refinancing of the north side, the rebuild of the north side, wasn't it?
Well, no, it was the East Stand that cost them a load of money. Unfortunately, when they eventually got round to rebuilding the East Stand in about '88, it was the time of the London property boom. So suddenly labour became far more expensive. Resources and parts and materials became far more expensive as well. And ultimately, ironically, he managed to get into the club because of it going over budget for the West Stand. It was the East Stand going over budget that effectively cost him the club. That they were starting to rack up some pretty huge debts as a result of it. There was also the infamous incident where the opening game of the 88-89 season against Coventry was called off literally 2 hours before the game was due to kick off, because the East Stand, which was supposed to have had some rebuild work done to it, wasn't safe and it didn't get the safety certificates. They had no choice but to cancel the game. Spurs were deducted 2 points as a result of that. And I think that was the point when it just felt that there was, Spurs fans, there was a real mockery around the club at the time. There was certainly it was sort of engulfed in incompetence, I think was the phrase I heard someone here used.
But there were some good things that came out through his era. I mean, you just look at the players he signed: Clive Allen, '84, Chrissy Waddle, 1985. Glenn Hoddle obviously came through our youth system and was integrated into the team. Gaza. I mean, these were stars that were brought into the club and kind of epitomised what Spurs was about in that era.
Oh, yeah, they were, and again, because he had these memories of Blanchflower, Mackay, Greaves, the glory team of the of the '60s. He always had he wrote in his book that he always had a vision that every great team had 3-star players, 3-star attacking players. So, at the end of the '89 season, he had Gascoigne and Waddle, and then he realised there was the potential, because they had Terry Venables as a manager, who in himself was a marquee signing, to get Gary Lineker again. So in his mind, he had his own holy trinity at Spurs of Gascoigne, Waddle and Lineker. But infamously again, 10 minutes before Lineker was due to be unveiled as a Spurs player, he gets this phone call in his office from an intermediary that they knew who was doing some work in France, who said, I've got someone who's interested in buying Chris Waddle from you. And that really threw him a curveball. And in his words, he spoke to Terry Venables about it, and they didn't want to sell Waddle, and they said, well, let's see how much we can get for him, because he's 28, he's on a very long contract, and they thought they might get 2.5-3 million, and they just said, well, about 5 million. And Marseille said, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll do that.
Marseille doing Marseille things Waddle of the period. Absolutely,
yeah, the infamous Bernard Tapie. So Spurs fans were left for a week with this sort of vision of having a team with Waddle, Gascoigne, Lineker, but it lasted a week because then Waddle was sold. And again, you read between the lines and you realise that the club's debt was racking up into the millions at this point, and perhaps he had no choice but to sell. And to some extent, that was down to his mismanagement of the club and the PLC, that they had accumulated such big debts.
Just as a point, have you ever looked at videos of what Waddle did at Marseille?
Yeah.
It was absolutely fantastic. We gave away probably the world's best winger. He was just on a different level to anyone else. I would say at his best, Waddle was more effective than Gaza, but that's a subjective opinion.
Yeah, well, when they were playing together, they almost had their own goal of the season competition. That each week one of them was outdoing the other one with really audacious goals and bits of skill. So yeah, losing Waddle was such a huge blow. I mean, no more so than to Gary Lineker, who essentially he'd signed for Spurs because of the promise that he was going to have Gascoigne, particularly Waddle, supplying him. So he was really upset when he found out that Waddle had gone. But yeah, the debts continue to rack up. They couldn't manage that. We also had this incident where one of the subsidiaries that Spurs had bought was Hummel UK, initially just to provide the kit for Spurs, and then sort of Scholar probably overthought it a little bit and thought, well, why don't we buy Hummel or buy their distribution channel within the UK? And what we'll do is we'll stock and supply kits for other teams that wear Hummel, who were Aston Villa, Coventry, Southampton possibly. But then he took his eye off the ball with that one. I guess that's the problem when you're trying to juggle too many plates. That the Hummel deal went really, really bad. That wasn't managed very well. That started hemorrhaging money out of the club, and it all became a bit of a farce. Where going into 1990, you got this juxtaposition where even without Chris Waddle, you got this brilliant team with Gascoigne and Lineker, managed by Venables, and a really good support act as well. So the likes of Gary Mabbott, David Howells, Paul Allen, Eric Tortsford, who were really good, solid players that helped to gel that team together. That's destined to win the FA Cup in 1991, at a point where the Spurs finances are just going completely out of control, and the account was effectively put in the special measures by the bank, and they got to a position where the only way out of it was going to be to sell Gascoigne, and that's really where Scholar's Spurs dream ends. Just 8 years after buying into the club. So actually, his tenure at the club, a lot of very significant things happen, but it's over pretty quickly.
Which, of course, brings us on to the next step. So Irving Scholar sells up initially to Alan Sugar with Terry Venables in tow. That fell apart pretty quickly. And suddenly we're in yet another court battle, I believe. Terry Venables departs the club. Alan Sugar takes full control, and tell us more. What happened next?
Oh God! So Alan Sugar.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah. Oh God.
Oh God. Yeah. Alan Sugar went into business with Terry Venables to buy the club. So Venables was always desperate. He didn't just want to be the manager. He had all these other side hustles and businesses that he was running. He'd written a novel that was serialized into a TV show. You might remember that, Austin. Was that the Hazel novels? Yeah. Yep. What he'd done? He owned a couple of nightclubs. His ambitions were much loftier than just being the manager or a coach of a football club, which is such a shame because, I mean, he's the first manager I grew up with as Spurs fan. I don't remember Keith Birkinshaw, so I can't really compare them through my own personal experiences. But for me, Terry Venables as a Spurs manager and as an England manager is by far and away the best that we've had. I think every player that played under him just said what an incredible coach he was. He had the full package of being a man manager as well. He could motivate players. He was really tactically astute. He had a good eye for a player. That put that to one side, but certainly he had the charm that he could attract players. He played a big part in Gascoigne and Lineker wanting to come to Spurs, and probably Teddy Sheringham and Darren Anderson a couple of years after. So Sugar and Venables were billed as being this dream ticket, because in Sugar you had this very, very successful businessman who everyone recognised would sort out all the financial problems at the club straight away. He would manage that, and then Venables would get on with running the football side of it. So yeah, this should have been perfect, but unfortunately, they both completely misunderstood each other. Sugar thought that he would just let Venables get on with the football side of it, and he would manage the business. Venables thought exactly the same. He thought Sugar would just be this sort of benefactor who would let him get on with everything, including running the club and allowing him to become the chief executive. Now, if anyone knows anything or knows anything about Alan Sugar, they'll know that he doesn't suffer fools, and he won't have the wool pulled over his eyes. So that was a clash waiting to happen almost from the day that they were put together. There was a couple of incidents. So in the first summer, so 91, he took over just after the FA Cup win, and he told Terry Venables, with no uncertainties here, we cannot buy a player until we've sold anyone. Do not spend any money. We haven't got the money until we've sold someone. He goes on holiday to find out that Terry Venables has bought Gordon Jury from Chelsea for £2.6 million. So that set them off on the wrong foot straight away. There was another incident where, after a couple of home games at White Hart Lane, someone said to Alan Sugar, aren't you sort of 50% owner of the club? And he said, well, yeah. He said, well, why are you sitting 3 rows behind the director's box? And why has Terry Venables got all his mates sitting in the front row? And again, Sugar not one to let something like that lie. There were clashes straight away. It was probably remarkable that it lasted 2 years, and then he sacked Terry Venables not just as chief executive but also as coach of the club, and that caused huge eruptions amongst the fan base. I mean, I was absolutely incensed at the time. I don't know whether you two can remember finding out that Terry Venables had been sacked and seeing all the reports on the news of these sort of baying mobs outside Sugar's mansion, including Neil Ruddock's wife, who was holding up a sign saying, "We want tea, no sugar." It then went to court. It was a very, very ugly episode that Sugar ultimately had to take it to a High Court judge to be ruled that he had it in his power to sack Venables as chief executive. So Venables was forced to sell up all of his shares, and that was his last association with the club. And you think now he's still the last man, possibly only man in the club's history to have won the FA Cup as both a player and as a manager. I don't know, for me, again, this might be just because of the era I grew up following Spurs. He symbolised everything that Spurs should have been about. I know other people
actually resonates with Brian Clough being sacked by Derby County for being a similar sort of large personality, the chairman that didn't approve. And yeah, I would say that he had a similar sort of quality to Brian Clough. Can't compare them because Clough was, double-time Champions League winners.
For sure.
But Venables was a superb manager. Gutted when he left.
Yeah. No, I think everyone was, and Alan Sugar said he felt like he'd shot Bambi. That was the sort of phrase that he used. I don't think he understood that groundswell of emotion and the fans' reaction towards Terry Venables. And from that point onwards, he was always right behind the 8 ball. And he arguably he lost. He lost any opportunity he had to be liked by the fans. That summer of '93 was a really bad one for him. He didn't get much better. He and his wife were threatened. It wasn't a good time. Really unedifying episode for the club. Oh no, the other thing I should say, I guess, about Alan Sugar is if he hadn't bought the club in 1991, though, really doesn't bear thinking about that. Robert Maxwell would have taken over instead. That was Scholar's preferred bidder. It was Robert Maxwell, who within 6 months, obviously his empire fell.
Sunk, wouldn't it?
That's it. I mean, goodness knows, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now, would we? There'd have been no Tottenham Hotspur for about the last 30 years if Robert Maxwell had taken over instead of Sugar. So I guess we should be grateful for that. Sugar, in some ways, is the complete opposite of, I guess, Irving Scholar, in that he wasn't a romantic. Allegedly, he walked past the bust of Bill Nicholson and asked, "Who's that?" And when he's apparently on record saying, "What do people keep going on about this double for? What's this double?" Everyone keeps going on about. So he definitely wasn't immersed in the history of the club. But I guess unlike Scholar, you would trust him to manage and to own a multi-million, potentially multi-billion pound organisation. In some ways, he was also ahead of his time. I think he was really the only one of the big 5 chairmen who saw the value in satellite television getting involved in football. There were undoubtedly personal interests because his company Amstrad made satellite dishes, and we know that he was very, very close with Murdoch, and undoubtedly saw the value, the personal value in Sky getting the Premier League contract and what that would do for the sales of satellite dishes. He, famously used the quote when he told Sky to blow ITV out the water in getting the deal for the first terrestrial, first domestic TV rights when the Premier League formed in 1992. He was the one who warned chairmen about what he called the prune juice effect of waging rises. The idea was, doesn't matter whether we're talking about hundreds, thousands, or millions, gentlemen, if you give these players, it will be like prune juice. It will come back. Yeah. No one will benefit from that apart from the players and from the agents. But his greatest moment as Spurs chairman was in '94. So Spurs had been found guilty by the FA of making irregular payments to players dating back to Scholar's era. And this is another thing that links the two of them. And Spurs would dock 12 points for the forthcoming season, banned from the FA Cup, and given a record fine of over £500,000. And that was the season we'd nearly got relegated just before it. So that 12-point deduction would have, should have been curtains for Spurs. But he was absolutely adamant that he was going to fight that. And ultimately he did. And in the meantime, he managed to sign Jurgen Klinsmann, which was the most audacious signing Spurs had made since Ardiles and Villa. It was definitely the first time that a major European superstar had signed for an English club. It was probably the turning point for the Premier League in its prominence compared to the other European leagues. And we had this world-class superstar. Nobody could believe it when Jurgen Klinsmann signed for Spurs in '94. It's one of my most vivid teenage memories, looking up on teletext just by chance to find out that, this world-class superstar who we'd seen playing the World Cup that year was joining Spurs. So I think he was a pioneer. The problem was that he got badly stung within 12 months with not just Klinsmann, but with Popescu and Dumitrescu. And then you had these really unsavoury incidents with him going and doing a TV interview and saying that these are all Carlos Kickables. And
the old Carlos Kickable quote, which will forever resonate with a lot of people. Yeah.
Well, he thought that foreign footballers were mercenaries coming in for the big money. They'll come in for a year, then they'll clear off again when there's a better offer elsewhere. And summer '95 was a really pivotal moment for Spurs then in the North London dynamic, because that was the summer that Dennis Bergkamp went to Arsenal. Now, there's a number of reasons why Spurs didn't sign him, but one of which I think was because Sugar felt his fingers had been so badly burned by Klinsmann that he thought that was going to be repeated with any expensive foreign signing. And we definitely missed the boat from there on. So signing Klinsmann and then what happened after it really set the scene, and I think it set Spurs back about 20 years. What happened that summer. So he didn't benefit from the opportunity that he himself had created and foreseen. And from that point, the mudslinging in public, the abrupt nature that he had, he'd fall out with fans, he'd give these incendiary interviews, claiming that if any of these other brain surgeons can come in and do better than me, then they're welcome to it. Until his time ran out, and he sold the club in 2000. But unfortunately, the Sugar years are remembered for the mediocrity, and Spurs became a mid-table team. And he once quoted how highly he thought of Wimbledon's model, where they would go and buy players cheap, train them up, sell them on for a profit, and finish in the mid-table. And you can't help think, but that really held Spurs back at a time when the Premier League was accelerating, and other clubs were spending a lot of money and speculating to accumulate, and really left Spurs behind. And it took us a very long time to catch up because of those decisions that Sugar made, which I'm sure were made with the very best of intentions at the time, but they really spectacularly backfired and had a very long-term impact on where we are now as a club.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think there was
thing here?
Go on, Austin, go on.
Okay, I was going to say there's a generational thing here, because when I started supporting Spurs, and I didn't, in those days you didn't glory hunt. You supported teams because you fancied them. I thought Spurs had the sexiest name. I thought Wolves was another great name because it was different from United or City, or Uh, so I started supporting Spurs, and then I realised that when we signed Jimmy Greaves, he said Tottenham are one of the biggest clubs in the country, and he was so modest and humble when he signed. But we were one of the biggest clubs in the country. But after the very early 80s, after we won the UEFA Cup the last time, our record seemed to disappear, and people started to not regard it as being one of the big clubs. Whereas in the 60s, we were up there with Manchester United, and then Liverpool actually gate crashed the party because they got promoted from the second division to the first division, and they became one of the big clubs because they won the league twice in the 60s. And now people don't regard Tottenham as being a big club. It's almost as if we're trying to encroach on being a big club, coming from behind, which on one level we are, but our fan base and our history is such that we are a big club, and I regard us as being a big club, but other people don't. And I think that psychology has impinged on the club for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stuart, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think that in Venables' case it was a situation of once bitten, twice shy? Obviously, he had the issues with Venables, and then he had the issues with Klinsmann, and suddenly he felt that he no longer wanted to be spending big money or investing, fairly heavily into a club where he felt that he was being pushed to the side a little. And as a result, he ended up buying players who were coming towards the end of their careers. I mean, however much I loved David Ginola, however much I thought Les Ferdinand was a solid enough striker, we're not talking about players who are at the top end of their careers at the time. I mean, I know Ginola went on to win the FA Writers Player of the Year award. But a lot of it was speculate to accumulate with Stefan Everson, Chris Armstrong, even Raul Fox to a point. None of those were stars who were going to come and absolutely change the club.
Everson was one of the top upcoming players. He got a very good reputation in Norway. And Chris Armstrong was ruined by Jerry Francis, who played him when he was coming back from injury before he should have done. And Armstrong was a very good player.
Armstrong was the first player I had across the back of my shirt, so I'm not going to complain. But I mean, we had solid players. I mean, and we also, of course, you can't ignore CADS member Alan Nielsen, who is a member of CADS, but also was a member of the Spurs team. So, I'm not sure which of those is more up there in terms of the best highlight. Pretty sure it might be his time at Spurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Spurs were guilty of under Sugar wasn't that they didn't spend money. I think he's quite right to point out that I did spend money. He just didn't spend it very wisely. They often bought players. I mean, you mentioned Les Ferdinand, Raul Fox, David Ginola. Let me put in Andy Sinton in there as well.
Andy Sinton.
That's 4 players off the top of my head who I'd say were, if we'd bought all of those players 2 or 3 years earlier when they were about to hit their peak, we'd have got a lot more joy out of them. We signed them all too late. Sugar's problem was that whereas Irving Scholar, I'm pretty sure if you spoke to Irving Scholar in about 1986, he would probably be able to tell you the starting 11 of pretty much every team in Europe. He could probably tell you what the reserve team was as well and how many caps they'd won for their country. And then you've got Alan Sugar, who didn't know what the double was. So he wasn't a football man, whatsoever. And he didn't surround himself with enough people who were knowledgeable enough about football until he appointed David Pleat as director of football in '97, which was the same point that we appointed Christian Gross, which was another well-intentioned move that went badly wrong. So I think there's a few things with him that the money was spent, but again, he'd at a point in the late 90s when clubs suddenly realised, they'd seen what Spurs had done with Klinsmann and the way that he had revolutionised them as a team, the whole mindset about how players prepare for games, the nutrition side to it as well. And he went against that, where Arsenal, Chelsea, even Middlesbrough were really investing into foreign players and to foreign and European ideas, which Irving Scholar had always been an advocate of. He was a real Europhile. He really didn't like how insular he thought English football was going to become. Well, Scholar kind of went exactly the opposite. He did a full 180 on that in Jerry Francis, who was a manager who really understood the British game and was perhaps from that old school. At a point when English football revolutionised, unfortunately, it was almost entirely down to Wenger's introduction and all the new concepts that he brought to a game. But at the point when other clubs were going that direction, we rode back the other way, and that was another reason that we fell so badly behind. If you look at the players that we signed towards the end of the 90s, we're still really only signing British players and a couple of Scandinavian players. So, nothing really any more adventurous than teams were doing 10 years before that. You think even Middlesbrough were attracting Janino, Emerson, Ravanelli to the club. So, there was a few real fundamental flaws with the business side of what, or the football business that was going on at the time.
Yeah, I think if you look back, I mean, you've got two fairly significant periods or sets of transfers. You've got Ossie Ardiles and Ricky Villa, who really opened up English football to bringing in foreigners. And then a lot of clubs jumped onto that. And then the Klinsmann signing suddenly go, oh, wow, how we can suddenly attract the best players in the world. Because I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he was the best striker in the world at the time. And he came in and other clubs, oh, we can do this as well. So suddenly you've got clubs like Chelsea who are buying Ruud Gullit and Vialli and players of that kind of level. And, obviously playing under Glenn Hoddle at the time, which was a bit sickening to see. But Spurs never really...
under Arsene Wenger, ironically.
Well, Arsene Wenger revolutionised the English game in many, many ways. I mean, I don't particularly like the guy, but you have to appreciate what he did for English football. So, you've got those two major transfers, which were Spurs transfers, but Spurs never really benefited from it in the long term, I think. Maybe we're starting to see that now with a bit more of a European... Well, I know Venables tried to introduce the European model first, but then when ENIC came in later on, they definitely introduced the European model and have tried several times to get it right, and it seems to be working right now. But we're not talking about them, so we'll do that another day. What would you say were the highlights of the Scholar era and the highlights of the Sugar era? We'll then get on to the negatives. Just the main points. Okay.
I think the highlights for both of them was the way that they modernised the stadium, the White Hart Lane as it was. If I think more perhaps about the north or south stands than the east stand, because I know that was controversial in its own right. Scholar, he had such good ambitions for the club. I think that's how he would like to be remembered. There was lots of good ideas. I mean, really, the genesis for everything we see in the modern game now dates back to Irving Scholar and the things that he was trying to do, whether it was in terms of getting TV to recognise the value and importance of English football, whether it was trying to make football a more inclusive environment for for families. That all came back to Irving Scholar. For Sugar, again, I would just say at a point where Tottenham's finances were absolutely perilous, he came in and saved us at the time. If it hadn't been for him, it would have been Robert Maxwell in charge, and he did sort out the club's finances. That there's no doubt. If you compare the balance sheet when he took over in 1991 compared to how it looked in 2001 when he sold it, it was it was completely different. That he probably provided a sound footing for his successors to come in and elevate the club further. But it was only because he came in and made some of the changes that he did financially that saved Spurs.
Austin, what are your overriding memories of Irving Scholar and Alan Sugar?
They're emotional rather than scientific, because I don't know the detail. So Gareth's just given me detail that I didn't know. So I hated Scholar because I thought Scholar set the club on a downward trend. That's emotional and from a distance, and not factually. It's entirely from between the ears. Sugar, I hated because he came out on top against Venables, who I loved, because I look at things from a football point of view, and Venables, until recently, was probably the best football manager we've had for a long, certainly since the General. he would outthink teams. He would plan tactics. He would change his tactics accordingly. He had a friendship with George Graham at Arsenal, but I think he was a better manager than George Graham, although George Graham won a title for Arsenal, if not two. So the fact that Venables got pushed out led me to dislike Alan Sugar, who I refer to as Big Al for the entirety of his reign. And we just seemed to descend into mediocrity at best under Sugar. And bearing in mind I came from the 60s, 70s and 80s when we won trophies, to see the club not only not challenging, but sort of looking average at best, it was heartbreaking. And around the turn of the sort of late 80s and early 90s, Hoddle went. My second favourite player ever after Jimmy Greaves. Chris Waddle went. Possibly my third favourite player ever after Hoddle and Jimmy Greaves. Gascoigne went. And as a football fan, they were the people. I would get out of bed if Spurs were bottom of the league, but Gascoigne was playing, or Waddle was playing, or Hoddle was playing. I'd get out of bed to go and watch those teams because I'd see that player and think, my God, they're doing things that no one else can do. So I look at it from a football point of view and as a football fan's point of view. So my views on the chairman are reflected by how the teams performed under them rather than what the chairman actually did. So what you've said has given me a lot of information, which I didn't know before, Gareth. But I only look at it as a football fan. And only now do I see, and I know we're going to come to this later, Stuart, so sorry, but only now do I see an owner and a board who are actually working on building the club in the right way, which is what I feel. Whereas previous to that, I thought Scola took the club down, and I thought that Sugar kept the club alive, but didn't do anything for my club. He didn't make my club attractive to watch. We had the odd highlights, but not very much. And so I was glad when it got taken over again. I think that encapsulates my view over the 20 years that we're talking about.
Okay, and last thing, Gareth, what would you say are the biggest mistakes that each individual made?
Scholar's biggest mistake was going into business with Paul Bobroff. I think if he'd gone it alone, things could have worked out very, very differently. I mean, he was very much a product of, this was the economy. This was sort of Margaret Thatcher's Britain, that you had all these speculators going in and buying all these companies, and he, ultimately that's what dethroned him in the end. The biggest mistake, I say the biggest mistake, the worst thing that Alan Sugar did was get rid of Terry Venables. Austin's articulated that incredibly well. When you see the detail of what was going on at the time, you kind of come to the conclusion that, he had to get rid of him, or if he had to get rid of him as the chief executive anyway. I think if Venables had said, no, I'm just going to go and work at the training ground, he was never going to do that, then things may have worked out differently. But it was unfortunately he made Spurs became mediocre in his time in charge, and it took us a hell of a lot of time to recover from that and to end on an upwards trajectory or not. Possibly it's because I've written and researched about both decades so extensively now, but I probably find myself coming up with some form of Stockholm syndrome when I think about Scholar and Sugar, and I'm probably being far more sympathetic to them than I should be, whereas actually Austin's articulated some of the visceral emotions and and memories that he feels talking about both of them. And ultimately both of them, Spurs were a poorer or a lesser club at the end of both of their reigns for various reasons, and I think that's probably how history will remember both of them. To that,
Gareth, I think that if Sugar had let Venables do what he wanted to do and be chief executive of the club, and if he'd stood in the background, I think Venables would have got the club going in the right direction. I think Sugar's ego because I think he's an arrogant prick, and I shouldn't say that on something that's recorded and published.
That's your personal opinion and not the opinion of the CADS podcast.
I think he is, not he is. I learned that one from Martin Yole.
Yeah.
I think that Venables would have got the club working properly because A, he was charismatic. B, he had good players playing under him. C, he knew the football game. And I think he would have guided the club as a football club. And if Sugar had stayed in the background and run the business, I think the club would be way in advance of where it became. But that's an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, look, I think from a football perspective, I absolutely agree with you. I think reading Sugar's book and watching, there was the very good Panorama documentary that I watched as part of my research that came out about around that time as well. And yeah, you were very much left with the conclusion that, Terry Venables wasn't fit to be the chief executive of the club. He was incredibly fit to be the manager of the team and to lead the football side of it. And the two of them unfortunately just couldn't exist together.
Yeah, I was reading an article recently about how a lot of fans or people outside of football seem to think that a reasonable manager would make a reasonable director of football, but the two things just don't line up. There are different requirements in terms of mentality and knowledge and things like that. And I suspect it's very, very close to being the same, well, almost exactly the same as being a quality football manager and a quality chief executive. So it's tough to say how it would have gone, but we're going to roll things up here, but thank you, Gareth, for joining us. Could you very quickly give us another look at that book and tell us where we can find it?
I will do, yeah, there you go. So the book is called Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? It tells you the story about Spurs throughout the roller coaster ride that was the 1990s. It's available. You can buy it personally from me. I know you're going to share the link to my site.
The link is down below.
The link is down below. There you go. The link is down there.
Yeah.
So you can buy it directly from me. You can also buy it from Amazon, or perhaps better still, go into your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it in as well. And then we've kind of talked around it, but I've got my second book coming out, which will be called Hot Shot Tottenham. That's due out, or not till September, so not for a long time. So if you'd have me back then, I'd happily come back and talk about that one then. And that is very much the same format. It will guide you through the 1980s. And tell you about Spurs in the 80s, where we go into more detail about certainly Irving Scholars' running of the club.
Excellent.
Is there a downloadable version?
Is it available as an ebook yet?
It is. Well, you can get it on Kindle via Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah, right. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll buy it.
So yeah, it'd be great to have you back on and we can discuss this a little bit more in depth. But also, I know you're active on Blue Sky. Could you give us a quick shout out to your Blue Sky handle and tell us where?
Oh God, I have to try and remember it now. What, my 80s, 90s,
90s, yeah, something like that.
80s, 90s Spurs book, yeah. Just the other thing I wanted to say, or just to try and sell the book, I guess, or just the concept of reading, is that I've got a huge pile of books. So my Christmas list, when I put my list together for Santa, it is almost exclusively books, largely about football. And I find, particularly in an age where it's so easy to get stuck on your phone, doom scrolling through Blue Sky's obviously not too bad, but other sites as well. And sometimes just the cathartic experience of actually physically picking up a book, or even reading a book on screen, as I know Austin likes to do, can be a really good thing for the soul. So whether you buy my book or whether you buy any book, really do encourage anyone. It might be a New Year's resolution for you. And the other thing I'll do, just to try and sell the book as well, and really appreciate you having me on here today, Stu. It's just learning what's happened in the past, whether it's football or not. I think we can learn so much about what's happening today or what might happen tomorrow by understanding what's happened in the past. I mean, certainly that's how I rationalise my support of Spurs now and how I follow football now. It's by understanding what happened previously. I think it really does give you some good insights and some really good context. And listening to people like Austin talk, who's got kind of decades of experience supporting Spurs.
Not many.
Not many. But Austin, you've literally seen you've literally seen everything, haven't you? You've even seen Spurs get relegated in that period. You've seen us win European.
I have indeed.
You've seen us win European trophies. So I definitely recommend people just take an interest in what's happened There are lots of really good Spurs books. We mentioned the Spurs biography. Read one of those. Just learn about how things used to be and try and compare it, and it will help you, I think, find some answers for what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
I've just followed you on
The
Blue
one
Sky, by the
thing.
way.
I see.
Excellent. The one thing I will say that probably makes your book stand out to some of the others is available in hardback, and a good hardback book is a thing of joy. I love cracking open a good book. Just the fresh, the smell of the page and everything, and I think a hardback book just makes it so much better. So yeah, Gareth, thank you very, very much for joining us. You are welcome back anytime you like, and when the new book comes out, please let me know, and I will add it to my list of Christmas and birthday presents I hand over to my wife on a regular basis. So thank you very much. Austin, thank you again for joining us. Gareth, we will be speaking soon, and until then, everybody, come on you Spurs.
Thank you, Stu. Nice to meet you, Gareth.
Thank you. You too, Austin.